We welcome the President of the Gujarat Education Society, Mr. B.B. Patel, President Dakshin Delhi Gujarati Mandal, Mr. Mahendra Bhai Patel. We also take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Mehul Kapadia, President of the South Delhi Club. May we invite the school choir to begin the celebration with a shlok, Nindantu Niti Nipunaha, written by Bharatri and taken from the Granth Niti Shatakam, followed by a song Shilpi Pravar, written by Sri Kamal Satyarthi, former Vice Principal of the school, and set to music by Uma Shankar Chandola, a former music teacher.
Nindantu Niti Nipura Ravi Suvantu Lakshmi Samavishatu Gacchatu Yathishtam Adyaiva Ma Maranamastu Yugantareva Nyayan Pathaha Ravichalanti Padam Adhira Aradhate Nakhalu Vigna Bharena Nichaye Prarabdha Vigna Vihata Viramanti Madhya Vignai Punarapi Pratihanyamana Prarabdhamuttama-jana Na parityajanti. तुमने हमें स्वाधीनता दी, एकता दी लोहन। तुमने हमें स्वाधीनता दी, एकता दी लोहन। दूता मनोहर हार सारे राष्ट्र हो शिल्पी प्रवर, शिल्पी प्रवर ओलाहन, शिल्पी प्रवर ओलाहन। तुमने हमें स्वाधीनता दी, एकता दी लोहन। दूता मनोहर हार सारे राष्ट्र हो शिल्पी प्रवर, शिल्पी प्रवर ओलाहन, शिल्पी प्रवर ओलाहन। तुमने हमें स्वाधीनता दी। तुमने किए जो कर्म अनुपम, जो पराक्रम थे किए। तुमने किए जो कर्म अनुपम, जो पराक्रम थे किए।
उनसे सदा बलिदान प्रेरक मंत्र है हमने लिए।
मंत्र है हमने लिए, तुमने दिखाया मार्ग जो हम नित सवारेंगे उसे। पल पल करेंगे राष्ट्र को दृढ़ कर नवीन प्रचंड कर। शिल्पी प्रवर उल्लंघन, शिल्पी प्रवर उल्लंघन। तुमने हमें स्वाधीनता दी, तुमने दिया आजाद भारत राजनीतिक रूप में। तुमने दिया आजाद भारत राजनीतिक रूप में।
अब हम करेंगे मुक्त उसको धर्म जाति स्वरूप में।
धर्म जाति स्वरूप में। शोषण गरीबी भूख भ्रष्टाचार के अभिशाप से सौगंध है सरदार हम करते रहेंगे नित समन। शिल्पी प्रवर उल्लंघन, शिल्पी प्रवर उल्लंघन। तुमने हमें स्वाधीनता दी, तुमने दिया जातीय गौरव साहसिकता शूरता। तुमने दिया जातीय गौरव साहसिकता शूरता।
एकीकरण नव संगठन अस्तित्व बोधक वीरता।
अस्तित्व बोधक वीरता था स्वप्न तेरा शक्ति बल का कुंज ये गणराज हो। वह स्वप्न हो साकार छोड़ेंगे न हम कुछ भी कसर। शिल्पी प्रवर उल्लंघन, शिल्पी प्रवर उल्लंघन। तुमने हमें स्वाधीनता दी, एकता दी लौहन। भूता मनोहर हार साए राष्ट्र हो। शिल्पी प्रवर, शिल्पी प्रवर उल्लंघन,
शिल्पी प्रवर
उल्लंघन,
शिल्पी प्रवर
उल्लंघन,
शिल्पी प्रवर
उल्लंघन।
Once there lived a man, a tall man, who walked the paces of this land. A man as tall as the Himalayas, with heart as wide as the oceans surrounding the land. A man not limited by icons or symbols, neither idolatry nor imagery. A man, a legend, a statesman.
On that note, may we invite Ms. Sheila Bhatt to welcome our chief guest. Ms. Sheila Bhatt has been a journalist for 4 decades, currently anchoring a weekly show, No Holds Barred. In her 40 years of Gujarati journalism on various issues, she has won the Chameli Devi Jain Award for successfully editing and publishing Abhiyan, a Gujarati weekly. We welcome you, ma'am.
Hello friends, good morning. Welcome SWAPAN DASGUPTA. Welcome ma'am, and welcome everybody who are watching us. Today is, as all of us know, that it's a big day for us. We are all Patelians and we are very proud of it. SWAPAN, heartfelt welcome to you. Let me introduce SWAPAN. It's a joy to introduce him because he's a very special kind of a journalist and a politician, and not a very commonly seen. Swapan Dasgupta was born in 1955. He is known as a center-right Indian politician and writer, more of a writer and less of a politician. Yet, he is a graduate of St. Stephen's College, Delhi. He did his MA and PhD from School of Oriental and African Studies, London. And he also later, after some break, later joined Oxford University to research and teach. He's a Padma Bhushan, a nominated member of Rajya Sabha, and he's a one very classic, I would say, classic intellectual who is articulating Hindu nationalism when it is most misunderstood. In a contemporary India, there are very few writers and thinkers who could express so effectively and continuously and consistently what a SWAPAN does. SWAPAN is also a very strong voice, helping to understand what's all going on in India currently. We are in a kind of a stage of a transformation and churning, and Swapan is a very important voice. He has been always a argumentative and compelling columnist also. His columns are actually what made him. We have been reading him since decades, and it's a when some big news happens in India, we have to check what Sapan said. So that is his power of writing. So back in 1990s, when the narrative in the English media was entirely dominated by the left liberal viewpoint, Sopan came, and he came with a strong arguments, and particularly background of history and his reference to history, which helped readers like us to understand what's on in India. And it was a kind of a much needed public balancing in a public discourse. So Sopan, very thank you so much for writing so well and help us understand India. Welcome, Sopan.
एक इनको ये बोल दीजिए एक और छोटा सा वो है हाँ
Okay. Namaskar. Good morning. Thank you very much, Sheila Ben. Thank you very much, Principal Anuradha Joshi, for honoring me with this invitation to your. I'm told it's not really a foundation day, but for all practical purposes, since your school has been founded with the inspiration of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, I think we could, in effect, call it an inspiration day, if not the foundation day. I think we are all here today amid very extraordinary circumstances. It's not been unusual, at least in my lifetime, to talk to students, to talk to anyone in a prolonged way or in a virtual medium. You all may be sitting in school, you all may be sitting at your homes. And a pandemic is something which we in this world are confronted to for the first time in our lives. But yet, it would help to reflect that as far as our forefathers were concerned, epidemics, they may not have called it pandemics those days, epidemics, devastating epidemics which took a huge toll in human lives, was something they had to live through all the time. The plague in the 19th century, the Spanish influenza, which took place immediately after First World War, outbreaks of cholera, which affected large areas, smallpox. And of course, if we go back even further, in the 14th century or so, there was the Black Death, which we call the Black Death, the outbreak of the plague. And at that time, nobody really had an idea of what was going to be the outcome. So they could only depend on what some medical practitioners prescribed, and those really were guesswork. Otherwise, all they could do was pray. I'm referring to this in the context that the pandemic, that sometimes we have a tendency, and this is true for everybody, we have a tendency of assuming that today is the most paramount and today is the most significant point in human existence. That's only natural because we are living in it today. But sometimes it's helpful to know the past, what people went through in the past. And more important, it's important to recognize the context in which they operated. And the context is very important. We can snigger, for example, to say that people in the past thought that the plague came from certain types of people and not from rodents. We can laugh at that today in hindsight. But we've got to treat everything in the context of what people thought at that time, what was the existing gamut of knowledge at that time, and assess people accordingly, and not always through our contemporary standards. And I say this in the context of the man whose life we are celebrating today. We have recognized the work of Sardar Patel in India. Today, I think it would be fair to say the much overdue national recognition that was due to this man has finally arrived. And that's not merely because somewhere overlooking the Narmada stands the world's tallest statue. That is only a small part of it. That's symbolic. But I think in the discourse, suddenly we find Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, the Sardar, actually coming in. Now, what was this Sardar? I'm not going to go into the narration of his entire life. What I'm going to do is pick up a few strands of the Sardar and look and see what they can instruct us about India, about values, and about our lives in general. First, let's look at the man, his background, his orientation. I think there was a perception that most people who come into politics, at least in that time, in the early part of the 20th century, who came into politics, it was assumed that most of them came from rather privileged backgrounds. And this by and large was true. You had very famous lawyers, you had people of men and women of letters, came from privileged backgrounds, who had privileged educations. Like I've had a very privileged education. And they were driven by ideas. And those ideas propelled them into the world of politics, where there was the need to give up a certain form of life. Sardar Patel wasn't really one of that. Sardar Patel was, in every sense of the term, very much part of the aspirational society of Gujarat in those times. He was a man who, by the stint of his own efforts, gradually climbed the professional ladder. Can you imagine a man who took his bar degree when he was nearly 35? Today, we would never consider such a thing. By the time we are 21, 22, we've more or less charted out our careers. We've moved ahead and done what is necessary, or are doing what is necessary. And here was a man who, because of personal difficulties, had to wait, had to try, had to struggle. Not struggle in a sense of, not struggle in the sense of actually having to, more or less be on starvation or something like that, but struggle in the sense of actually getting to climbing up the ladder. And today, it's sometimes very difficult to understand that the obstacles in the path of people who came from small towns, who didn't come from the metropolitan centers, the access to them, their struggle was far greater because the opportunities were far more limited. So Sardar Patel could become a barrister, taking his exams at a very short time, much before the prescribed period. I mean, people normally take it in 3 years in a very leisurely fashion. He condensed it and did it in about 18, 20 months. Did rather well. Became a lawyer of some consequence and repute. And that's important. So here was a man who, right from the outset, was determined that he would make the most of his life. That he took to politics was something secondary. It was not a hereditary profession for him. It was something he stumbled into from law. It would interest everyone to know that among the Mahatma Gandhi was probably the greatest inspiration of our national movement. He was not merely a political leader, he was a moral guide to everyone in the field at that time. But, and I think this is very important, which sometimes we forget, a lot of Gandhiji's ideas were never really accepted even by his closest followers. We all know that, for instance, Jawaharlal Nehru had a certain cosmopolitan vision, which was at odds with the Mahatma's own thing. Singh too had ideas which didn't correspond to everything which the Mahatma believed in. So a lot of people say that Sardar Patel was a Gandhian. Yes, he was a Gandhian, insofar as that he accepted the moral and political leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. But he was not a Gandhian. If you say, did he accept the entire philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi in its entirety? There, I think he was not. And neither was Nehru. Neither was Acharya Kripalani. Neither was my Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. The national movement in India brought together large numbers of people who acknowledged the political and moral leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, but did not necessarily agree with the Mahatma in the larger philosophy of life. And I think it's important to recognize that. Because in politics, everything is not black and white. There are large shades of grey. People identify with political parties not because they agree with everything, but because they find that to be the suitable instrument in which a certain mission can be accomplished. A mission cannot be accomplished individually, and a mission can be accomplished only by moving in collective tandem. So the versatility of India always depends on our ability to bring together people of different political orientation, different mental outlooks, different philosophies, etc. Because it's that whole gamut which confers a certain richness to us, and where we don't necessarily lose our individuality. Sardar Patel never lost his individuality. Sardar Patel was a dedicated follower of Mahatma Gandhi in the realm of politics. But the Sardar always had a certain robust independence of his own views. And this independence of his own views came into the fore as the freedom struggle moved on. And when it became very clear, by about the 1930s, it became very clear that India was going to become free. India was going to become independent. The question was, when? If the British point of view was to be accepted, it would happen gradually. You'd get dominion status, and from there it would progress, etc., etc. The others were in a tearing hurry. They said, no, we want independence and we want full independence. We don't want this dominion status. But regardless of these two positions, what was very clear was not merely that India was going to be free, but that it was necessary to prepare for independence. It's one thing to get power. It's another thing to be able to handle power. And handling power is probably more difficult than acquiring power. And Sardar Patel was one of those very few people in that national movement who, given his prominence in life, within the national movement, actually realized that it was necessary to prepare for power, prepare those institutions, and be ready. So when it was conferred on you, you would be able to handle it with deftness. And that's what we see in him right to the 1930s. He didn't go out too much. He was not a great publicist in that sense. He preferred quiet backroom approaches. The idea of negotiations were very important to him. He had to negotiate your way. Everything was not done through a movement. It was those negotiations which played a thing. How do you manage an election? How do you forge alliances with people who are not necessarily your own? India is a country where you have to stake alliances, and that's the important thing about power, is that you come across people who are so very different, whose interests, whose outlook, whose orientation are so very different from that of yours. But you must strike a rapport with them. You must come into a common understanding with them. You must try and understand them for them to even understand you. And it's that process which Sardar excelled in. But at the same time, let me tell you one thing, that when it came to the handling of popular movements, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel never shirked away from going into the streets, courting arrest, braving lathis. There was that resolute courage with him. He was the man who prepared the farmers of Bardoli Satyagraha, of Bardoli in Gujarat. It was not merely a movement, it was far more. It required a tremendous amount of moral courage to actually persuade large numbers of farmers that if they wanted to fight against an unjust and excessive taxation, they should be prepared to have their own possessions confiscated by the government. It's not merely a question of them getting beaten up by lathis. That's a one-off thing. It was more than that. You get your possessions taken away, your utensils confiscated, your cows, your other animal livestock which you have there taken away. How do you prepare an entire community to act together so that there are no cracks? And it was Sardar Patel who, as the leader of the Bardoli Satyagraha, which I think is probably constitutes his seminal achievement, who actually showed what courage meant and why a political agitation had to be accompanied by a great deal of moral resolve. I think that's one of the proudest moments of India's independence movement, the Bardoli Satyagraha, which Sardar Patel led. Another factor which I think people often forget, people often say Patel was always a person who was a pragmatist, who knew when to give, when to take. Yes, and that's true up to a point. But when it came to the crunch, when it came to finally saying, look, enough is enough, Sardar Patel never shirked that duty. And it was that ability to take the decision at the right time. The Quit India movement is a classic example of that. There was a war waging all over Europe. the British Empire was in a state of siege. The Japanese had taken Burma. They had taken Singapore, which was considered the impregnable fortress. They were advancing on the doors of India. The British Empire was tottering. And that time, Gandhiji said, it's not a question of us waiting till you win the war. We need to get independence right now. Leave India to God and anarchy is what he said. But there were a lot of skeptics in that. There were a lot of people who said, look, the timing is not right. We understand your objective, but your timing is not right. I think Sardar Patel had enormous sessions with Gandhi about whether the timing was right or not. But once he was convinced, it was Sardar Patel who came out and delivered probably the most forceful message, saying, this is the Quit India thing. Now the question in hindsight, we can say, was he right, was he wrong? What I find important is the belief that once he was convinced, he had that flexibility to be able to take it on with a degree of courage. And finally, the point which I want to come across is again in this question of handling of power. I think a lot of us, when we go and see the ceremony at Red Fort on 15th August, sometimes think that it was it sort of happened. India was born on, independent India was born on 15th August 1947. One flag came down, another flag went up. I wish it was so simple. But if you look at the map of India on 14th August 1947, it wasn't merely a question that the creation of Pakistan, the partition of India, created a huge number of strains and fissures in everybody's, in the entire polity. People, millions of people dispossessed both from the east as well as from the west. We often forget that there was a partition in the east also. Sometimes in Delhi, I come across people who forget that partition also happened in this part of Bengal also, and a pretty horrific partition also. But that was one aspect. But then you look in another way. You find the map of so-called British India, and you find it pocketed with small principalities. Some huge, like Hyderabad, Baroda, Gwalior, Kashmir. These were huge kingdoms, Travancore. And after that, all over Saurashtra, where Sardar Patel, there were pocket-sized things. Some people had gun salutes, 21 gun. There used to be a competition among the princes as to who would get the 18 gun salute, 16 gun salute. If you look at some of the principalities in Saurashtra, I wonder sometimes whether they get a water pistol salute or not. But some of them had postage stamps, some of them were enlightened rulers, some of them were ridiculously debauched rulers. But the whole country was fragmented into hundreds of little principalities. A relic. This is an inheritance. This was part of how the British increased their power in India by striking alliances. So the British regent, the British agent would actually dictate what was going on, while the Maharajas would have nominal control. Some of them even had their own currency notes. Certainly all of them had postage stamps. In case some of you collect postage stamps, which I do, for example, you find that these old stamps of these princely states like Bhopal and Tabarko, places like Charkhari, places like Morvi, these are some of the most valued possessions today you can have in terms of postage stamps. But how do you integrate all of these into India? Now that was, in one sense, that was a project which had never been thought through in a comprehensive manner while we asked for freedom. What do we do? So many different states. Areas where you had informal control, the Northeast. How do you integrate them into the one Indian Union? And you know, this was a project of huge, infuriating complications. The different types of demands, the different types of egos, the different types of traditions, the personalities involved. How do you get them all on board? This huge managerial political exercise. And it was left to Sardar Patel as Home Minister, as the first Home Minister of independent India, to actually strive for that. And he did it, sometimes with skill, sometimes with charm, sometimes with patience, and occasionally with a bit of the stick. We know where the stick was employed. In Travancore, for instance, he had to use a little bit of the stick, gently. He had to use the stick a little more firmly. In the case of Hyderabad, these were big. Also a series of what if. We love to deal with what we call counterfactual history. What might have been had so and so and so. This is a very interesting game all of us like to engage in. Now, the game of counterfactual history, which interests India quite a lot, is what if the entire process of the integration of all states in Indian Union been assigned to Sardar Patel alone? Actually, Sardar Patel had responsibility for every single one of them, except one. He did not have responsibility for Jammu and Kashmir. And a lot of people say that the complications which India subsequently encountered was because it lacked that firmness, that clarity of mind, and that sort of patriotic nationalist resolve which Sardar Patel demonstrated in the course of his other things. This is what is often said. This is the form of counterfactual history. But the reality is that Sardar Patel was not entrusted with Jammu and Kashmir, and Jammu and Kashmir remained the loose strand. Whereas in the case of all the others, they got integrated into the Indian Union. That leads to another question. Throughout the national movement, Indians, those Indians who had joined the Congress, who had joined other nationalist associations, always that we must obliterate all signs of British rule. And that at that time there was a fierce passion behind that. However, when it came after independence, there was also the necessity of choosing what we should discard and what we should maintain. I believe that Sardar Patel took a very informed decision that we must maintain some of the administrative institutions which have helped us. But Sardar Patel was very clear in his mind that when it comes to the cultural issues, it must be the Indian ethos which prevails. That's why I'm very glad that I have been asked to speak at your school. Because in your school, unlike the type of education, for example, I received, where it was a bit too one-sided in one direction, here you're able to appreciate the global world, but firmly rooted in an Indian milieu. That was what Sardar Patel's life was all about. He was very much a son of the soil, of an India which was operating in a global context. It's that vision which he brought about in his life. Who knows? Again, to come back to the counterfactual. In 1947, most of the states, the leaders of the Congress, the provincial Congress people, they said that they would like Mahatma Gandhi to nominate Sardar Patel to be the leader of India post-independence. Mahatma Gandhi had other views. And the other great counterfactual which I must pose as I finish this conversation with you is, what would have happened if Mahatma Gandhi had heeded the majority advice of the Congress? Would the India today we see be a little different from the India which we would have got had Sardar Patel been in charge, and which would have been better? These are not questions which we can have only one answer, but we can recognize that at the end of the day, Sardar Patel represented a force, he represented a vision, he represented a pillar, a robust pillar of Indian values, contemporary values. He will be one of the most authentic of Indian heroes of the previous century and for all time. Independent India will always be grateful to him. I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you, even though it is from a distance. I thank you very much. Namaskar.
May we now invite the school choir to sing an all-time favorite of the school, Kiran Punch. The song has been set to music by Kanu Ghosh.
सरि म पनि सा नि प म रि सा नि सरि म पनि सा ग ग रे प रे गे रे ग तमस को हटा ले
प्रभालोक नर की लिए आ रहे हम
गगन पर गिरे मन तमस को हटाने
प्रभालोक नर की लिए आ रहे हम
नई रात काली उसी भूल जाऊं कि मिलके ये नव सुबाला रही है किरण कुंजली सरेरा किरण कुंजली सरेरा
नाना तुम ना तुम नाना तुम नाना ना पूरब का डेरा ना पश्चिम का डेरा समर्पण की बंसी से होगा सवेरा ना पूरब का डेरा ना पश्चिम का डेरा समर्पण की बंसी से होगा सवेरा
तेरा ये मेरा की लगुता मिटाने
नहीं चेतना श्रम लगन ना
रहे किरण कुंजली किरण कुंजली चले व्योम तक ले चलेंगे कि सरदार के स्वप्न पूरे करेंगे
जमाने की सूरत
बदल के रहेगी किरण कुंजली
चले आ रहे हैं चले आ रहे हैं चले आ रहे हैं
Sardar, a moniker that the women of Bardoli lovingly gave him, refused to be restricted by narrow walls of caste and community. He believed that such boundaries hampered the growth of a nation. With sheer grit and immense courage, with tact, diplomacy, and pragmatism, which was characteristic of him, he wove the fabric of Indian nation. As independent India's deputy prime minister and home minister, he was called upon to tackle the most intricate and baffling problem of the integration of princely states with the Indian Union. In reducing the princely states from 562 to 26 administrative units, he brought democracy to nearly 80 million people of India.
The architect of the Indian nation, Sardar, is synonymous with national integration. Justifiably, we celebrate this day as Rashtriya Ekta Divas in his honor.
May we now invite the principal of Sardar Patel Vidyalaya, Ms. Anuradha Joshi, to give the vote of thanks.
Celebration of the 145th birth anniversary of Sardar Patel, Shri Bhailal Patel, President of GES, and all members of the Gujarat Education Society, Shri Mahendra Bhai Patel and members of the Dakshin Delhi Gujarati Mandal, Shri Mehul Kapadia and all members of the South Delhi Gujarati Club, and all from the Sardar Patel Vidyalaya Parivar. A very good morning to all of you. As we celebrate this Sardar Patel Jayanti virtually. We celebrate the legendary Sardar's birth anniversary each year and recall lessons from his life and his work that would serve all our students and us as lessons for examples of a life to lead and a vision to aspire for. You are right, Mr. DASGUPTA. This is indeed a day of inspiration for us. Perhaps this year, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we can understand a little better this very colossal leader and his power of organization as he tackled the most intricate and baffling problems in newly independent India. The care, thoughtfulness, foresight with which he presided over efforts to bring back order and peace to a country ravaged by strife, sorting out problems of partition, rehabilitating thousands of refugees with courage, reorganized services which had become depleted with the departure of the British, and formed new services to provide a stable administrative base to a nascent democracy. India, sir, has come a long way from the baby steps it took as a free nation. A heartfelt thanks to you, sir, for your address this morning. Mahatma Gandhi has described the Sardar as gold, sir, and as you said, a powerful negotiator and a backroom boy. The world has known many leaders who have been known to break big nations to small parts. He, perhaps, is the only historical figure to have aggregated all those little states to one big whole. Thank you, sir, for the time and effort that you have put in to address us this morning once again. Sheila Ben, thank you for introducing our esteemed guest. We would also like to acknowledge the sources of photographs used in our presentation for the choir's rendition of Shilpi Prabhar. These are from the collection at the National Archives, and a few are from the Kulwant Roy collection published in the book History in the Making by Aditya Arya. Thank you to the Vidyalaya choir for these poignant and moving songs, remindful of the Shilpi Prabhar, who dedicated his life and all he had to the cause he served, that of freeing our country from bondage. Truly, samarpan ki bansi se hua hamara savera. A special thank you to Riya Rajpal for gifting the school with a wonderful portrait of the Sardar on this occasion, which has been rendered in her inimitable style with eyes that speak. Dare I say, he looks at all of us with expectation, borrowing the Sardar's words as reported by Narhari Parikh, which he is reported to have said after securing victory in the Borsar Satyagraha in 1924. He said, and I quote, "The real test of your love will be when I make you fight your own limitations and perhaps grow stronger to serve our country." Our grateful thanks to students and compeers and to Sehran Khan for stitching the videos together for this occasion. Also to all staff members and students who have worked behind the scenes for the program. Our sincere thanks to all guests who have joined us in this live stream to pay homage to one of the greatest sons of the soil. If I could conclude by quoting the Sardar's words, which ring so apt for the current time, for us as citizens of free India. And I quote, "The negligence of a few can easily send this wonderful ship to the bottom. It requires the wholehearted cooperation of all on board so that we can be safely brought to port. Wishing all safety and good health in pandemic times, and may the country grow stronger on the shoulders of each battalion. Jai Hind." Thank you once again, Mr. DASGUPTA, from all of us. Thank you, sir.